As they embraced in the heat of the moment, the man's eyes suddenly went distant and hollow. Their lips suddenly fused together, and Amy panicked, shoving him away. She angrily demanded an explanation, and only then did Jack snap back to his senses. Desperate, he explained that ever since they returned to this town, his body had been moving on its own. But Amy, still furious, ignored him and stormed into the guest room. That night, something even stranger happened. Jack jolted awake, finding himself lying in the hallway. An unseen force was dragging him toward the guest room, his body no longer fully under his control. As he was dragged closer, he braced his limbs against the walls, barely managing to stop himself. Before he could catch his breath, a strange banging sound came from inside the room. Then Amy burst out in a horribly twisted posture, being dragged toward him against her will. They had no idea what was happening, yet instinctively tried to pull away from each other. But the force twisted their bodies back, dragging them together like magnets. As their hands locked together, a sickening creak echoed their flesh, beginning to fuse. The pain was unbearable, stealing their breath until Jack suddenly remembered the muscle relaxants in a nearby drawer. Amy struggled toward the drawer, their fused arms fusing even faster with every movement. Just in time, she reached it and pulled out the medication. With Jack's help, pills spilled across the floor, and they frantically swallowed them. Trying to make the drugs kick in faster, they dropped to the floor, licking the pills off the ground. As the drugs took effect, the horrifying fusion finally began to slow down. They pressed their feet against each other for leverage, trying to pull their arms apart, but before they could break free, the drugs knocked them unconscious. When Jack woke up, he found himself tied to a chair, with a chainsaw resting on the table beside him. Amy planned to cut them apart and gave him something to drink to numb the pain. Panicked, Jack insisted there had to be another way, but the sickening creaking sound came from their arms again. With no time left, he reluctantly agreed to the unthinkable. Taking a deep breath, Amy slowly brought the chainsaw toward their arms, the pain hitting them instantly. After what felt like forever, their arms finally separated, and they collapsed as far away from each other as possible. They had no idea why this was happening to them. What they didn't realize was that it had all begun the moment they arrived in this town. Over time, their love faded, leaving behind a relationship in name only. Hoping to fix things, they set out on a hike into the woods outside town. But a sudden downpour swept in, and they quickly lost their way in the forest. Tensions flared, and in the middle of a heated argument, Jack slipped and fell into a nearby pit. Amy rushed to help, but ended up falling in with him. Luckily, the drop wasn't deep and they weren't hurt, but their phones were soaked and completely dead. As rainwater poured into the hole, Jack decided they should wait it out before trying to climb out. After a while, Amy grew tired and thirsty, but the murky water around them was undrinkable. Seeing this, Jack gave her the last of their clean water, while he reluctantly drank from a nearby spring. Unbeknownst to them, something was already seeping into his body, and the real nightmare was just beginning. Taking advantage of the moment alone, Amy tried to talk things through and mend their relationship. But Jack instead started talking about his childhood trauma. As a child, his father always complained about a strange smell in his room, but Jack could never find its source. That was until his father opened the ceiling light fixture and found a pile of rotting rats inside. Only then did he realize he couldn't smell it, because he had grown used to it. Later, his father died in his sleep, and his mother, unable to accept it, pretended everything was normal. It wasn't until Jack noticed the smell and opened their door that he discovered the truth. The experience left a deep scar, making him fear the kind of inseparable, suffocating bond that comes with marriage. Eventually, they drifted off mid-conversation, but in the middle of the night, Jack woke to the sound of heavy breathing. He sat up to look around. The cave was silent, yet the breathing didn't stop. Worse still, the sound was coming from the cave walls themselves, rising and falling in sync with his breathing. Terrified, Jack broke down in tears and turned to wake Amy. But Amy's eyes snapped open with a strange clicking sound. Then a pair of hands suddenly grabbed his head. Jack jolted awake. It had all been a nightmare. Amy was shaking him, telling him the storm had passed. They struggled to their feet, ready to leave, but something felt off with their legs. Amy pulled back the blanket in panic. Their legs were somehow stuck together. Desperate to get out, they forced their legs apart despite the pain. Jack guessed it might be some kind of fungus, and they didn't think much of it as they left. After returning home, Amy drove into town for supplies, while Jack stayed behind to clean himself up. The moment Amy drove away, Jack suddenly blacked out, his body slamming into the wall, completely beyond control. As Amy steered the car, the invisible force shifted too, dragging him unpredictably along with it. It was as if some magnetic force had seized him. He hurtled toward her, smashing his head until blood ran, only then finally snapping awake. Realizing something was wrong, he rushed to see a doctor. After hearing him out, the doctor dismissed it as anxiety-induced panic, merely prescribing some muscle relaxants. Casually, the doctor mentioned a couple who had gone missing nearby. Their last known whereabouts were in the very same forest. That immediately set off alarm bells for Jack. His strange symptoms had begun right after leaving those woods. He hurried home and looked them up, confirming they had vanished near that very cave. A chill ran down his spine. Just as he was about to tell Amy, a sudden knock echoed at the door. Amy opened the door to find their neighbor Bailey, standing there with a welcoming smile. He warmly welcomed them to the neighborhood, and they invited him in. During the conversation, when Bailey learned that they had fallen into the cave, he explained that it had once been a church. After a collapse incident, many of the worshippers collectively ended their lives inside the church. Uneasy, Jack and Amy exchanged looks, and Bailey quickly changed the subject. After chatting for a while, he excused himself and left. Late that night, Amy woke to the sharp pain of her hair being yanked, accompanied by a strange rustling behind her. In a panic, she flipped on the light, only to see Jack staring blankly, chewing and swallowing her hair. She yanked her hair free, and Jack finally snapped back to his senses. Together, they painstakingly pulled the hair from his mouth, staring in stunned confusion at the pile on the bed. The next day, as Jack was leaving for a tour, Amy stopped him to talk about last night's events, but he brushed her off, eager to leave for the tour, and rushed out the door. She followed and saw him off at the station, then returned to town alone. As Amy moved farther away, the same uncontrollable urge returned. He couldn't control his dependence on her. Even after taking a muscle relaxant, the unnatural craving wouldn't fade. In the end, he abandoned the tour, and in a daze, made his way to the school where Amy worked. Before long, Amy spotted him at the school, and quickly pulled him into a nearby restroom. Confused, she asked what he was doing there, but Jack, dazed, simply pulled her close and started getting intimate with her. Amy had always hoped they could go back to how things used to be, and seeing Jack suddenly show affection again, she pulled him into a bathroom stall, eagerly responding to his passion. But in the middle of it, something strange happened again. Their bodies seemed fused together like glue, pressed tightly against each other. Even the slightest movement sent sharp pain through them. Worse still, as they tried to pull apart, a student accidentally walked in on them. While the student ran off to get a teacher, they forced themselves apart through the pain. But just as Amy stepped out, Bailey arrived and saw everything, leaving her mortified. The incident earned her a harsh warning, and on the way home, she lashed out at Jack. Jack tried to explain it wasn't intentional, but Amy refused to listen and stormed off to Bailey's house. At Bailey's place, Amy apologized and claimed it was just the result of an argument with Jack earlier that afternoon. Bailey didn't press the issue. He simply invited her in to settle her nerves. Inside, Amy noticed a photo. Both people in it looked like Bailey, yet neither was him. Before she could think further, Bailey handed her a drink and began opening up about his own relationship experiences. He said he'd once been in the same situation, constant arguments pushing a relationship to the brink. He chose to walk away, but by the time he had come to his senses, it was already too late. His words struck her. Maybe they could get through this together after all. In the end, thanks to Pele's guidance and Jack's apology, the two made up. That night, as they got close again, Jack lost control and hurt Amy, so she angrily chose to sleep in a separate room. Even worse, they were pulled toward each other again in the night, their arms beginning to fuse together. Though they slowed it with muscle relaxants, they still had to use a saw to separate the fused part. Determined to uncover the truth, Amy planned to go to the hospital, but she'd left her keys at Bailey's, and when she went back, she saw something horrifying. A strange ritual played on the TV, showing two people fused together inside a church. A couple in love exchanged rings, then entered that same cave in the woods. They drank from the spring, slit their arms, and lay down together. Before she could keep watching, Bailey appeared behind her, wearing the ritual robes. Through his unhinged confession, Amy finally learned the truth. The cult believed that lovers were once a single being, split in two by God. After drinking from the spring in the cave, two people in love would merge back into one, becoming whole again. And the person that couple ultimately became was Bailey. The horrifying truth made Amy tremble, but Bailey, completely unhinged, rushed forward, slashed her arm, saying it would speed up the ritual. The pain sent Amy stumbling back. She shoved him away and ran out of the house. Meanwhile, Jack returned to the cave in search of answers and saw the same disturbing symbol. As he struggled to process it, a two-headed creature suddenly grabbed his ankle and dragged him down. It was clearly the missing couple, having failed to merge. They had transformed into this horrific form. Hearing their desperate cries, Jack guessed that one of them couldn't bear the pain and had taken their own life. That interruption had twisted the ritual, leaving them in this horrific state. As the creature closed in, Jack reacted on instinct, pulling out a knife and stabbing it. He then bolted for the exit, desperate to find Amy. When they finally reunited, they both knew the truth was clear to them now. They tried to keep their distance, but the force yanked them to the ground. No matter how they fought, they were helpless, dragged toward each other. Realizing there was no escape, Jack came up with a way to end it once and for all. He dropped to one knee and finally said the words Amy had waited so long to hear: his proposal. He admitted he had always believed another life might suit him better, and that belief had hurt her again and again. But after everything, he realized she was the one he truly wanted to protect for the rest of his life. He raised the knife, ready to sacrifice himself so she could be free of the curse. But just as he was about to act, he noticed blood spreading across him. Amy's arm was still bleeding. If it didn't stop, she would bleed out. But Amy didn't care. Having finally felt his true love, she was already at peace. Her consciousness faded, and she collapsed from blood loss. To save her, Jack chose to merge, healing her wound in the process. This time, he wasn't just healing physical wounds, but also the scars they'd left on each other over the years. He placed the token he once gave her into a record player, then stepped aside and began to dance. As the music played, they shed their clothes and bandages, laying bare their final confession. They kissed deeply, savoring the last moments that belonged only to them. Soon, amid the familiar cracking sounds, their bodies began to merge. There were no screams, only gentle intimacy, as Jack and Amy became one in love. All their distance and conflict turned into something that nourished their bond. In the face of despair, they found their love again. And in the end, love fused two broken souls into one, an eternal union.